Qantas is an airline so easy to hate. So how can an airline bring so much pride and yet have people want to fling rotten eggs at it at the same time? We explore in this video what the airline is like after Alan Joyce and how the brand has weakened in the last decade.
Step 1, wake up early, gonna rise with the sun. Step 2, get some good, some food in you. Step 3, think real hard about what you wanna be. Step 4, fuck everybody, just do your thing.
Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. 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 Wake up.
And good day everyone, that's right, I'm coming to you from the Sydney Airport Domestic Terminal, and this is a continuation of my trip from New Zealand, and I got off the LATAM flight earlier on. So I'm on the final leg of my journey back home. So I'm flying from Sydney to Adelaide with Qantas in business class. That explains why I'm in the Qantas terminal. So yeah, let's get this very long drawn journey back home started right now. Let's do this.
Everybody just do your thing.
That's right. Long drawn are the keywords for this final flight home, which is happening some 24 hours later than scheduled. Let me explain why. This series began in Adelaide Airport almost 2 weeks ago, where I flew to Melbourne to film an eventful foodie video. Australia's newest low-cost airline brought me to Sunshine Coast, where I found myself in Gympie and experienced history riding one of Queensland Rail's last retro suburban trains to Brisbane. From there, the world's most beautiful business class formed the backdrop of my international entry into New Zealand. The country's newest train service brought me from Auckland to Hamilton, and I then got airborne and found myself at New Zealand's southernmost airport in Invercargill. I got back to Auckland, where a flight cancellation saw me stranded there for an extra day. And that's how I got back to Sydney 24 hours late. And I am now on the final episode of this amazing journey I've had. If you like such exhausting itineraries, previous episodes of this series are now available in the description. Even better, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell so you'll know every time I embark on such a crazy journey again. Giving me a like will encourage me to ensure content flowing. So here's a thanks, because your support is very much appreciated. After that ordeal with LATAM Airlines in Auckland, suppose it was a blessing that I booked this entire flight on one booking reference. So this flight with Qantas today was automatically rebooked after yesterday's cancellation. I have never been so relieved to be back on home soil after that mentally exhausting episode of dealing with LATAM Airlines and Swissport in Auckland Airport. They truly take incompetence to a whole new level. But I digress. So let's take a deep dive into Qantas today and why I'm doing this episode. The dissatisfaction with Qantas has been slowly brewing and simmering for a very long time. Expensive fares, shitty, uncompetitive in-flight products, glossed over by slick marketing and advertising campaigns to keep people coming back. The tipping point was at the end of the last financial year, when the airline proudly announced a whopping $2.6 billion profit, patting the backs of their execs and members of the boardroom with extremely handsome monetary rewards. The powers that be were then dragged into several Senate hearings, the ACCC launching an investigation into Qantas selling ghost flights, and it all climaxed into the early resignation of Alan Joyce in September this year. So how can an airline so profitable and yet see their share prices plunge to such low and unimaginable levels? I have had more than a handful of you guys ask me to do a Qantas video about my thoughts of the goings-on. The public upheavals, the dramatic hearings, the yelling at the annual AGM, seeing microphones turned off and such. Every other week was another story hogging the headlines. It was exhausting, like the presidency of Donald Trump. No one could keep up. So now that Vanessa Hudson has taken over as the CEO, it seems like things have quietened down heading into Christmas. So perhaps this is a good time for me to chime in. To understand the brand decline of Qantas, one needs to look back at the early 2000s. The airline by then had been privatized for over a decade. Prior to that, it was a nationalized airline as part of the government's arm to showcase Australia to the world. And it was such since 1947 as Qantas Empire Airways. So, as a nationalized airline, it also meant their labor cost structure was somewhat rigidly high. A company's branding is said to be creating an identity in the minds of your target audience. This is done through different channels like the company's name, logo, visual identity, design language, and messages put out through marketing collaterals and advertising campaigns. Besides all those channels mentioned, direct frontline employees also carry the responsibility of this branding communication, shaping the minds and emotional connection the traveling public has with this airline. And with these frontline employees in mind, let's talk about the joys of getting a job as a direct employee of a Qantas flight attendant back in the day. You're talking about an extremely handsome pay package with airline benefits for your peers to envy. The work was extremely tiring because Australia is at one far-flung corner of the globe. So that meant every international flight which left our brown continent was a long-haul, multi-stop affair traversing the globe. Multi-day layovers, dinner in Singapore, lunch in Paris, sundowner bevies in Honolulu. You get the idea. Not only were you paid very well, this was almost an ironclad job for life. And these employment agreements were very well protected by the unions, which is a strong, formidable force to reckon with to protect workers' rights and employment conditions. And this very protection would become the bone of contention as time went along. As a government-owned legacy carrier, Qantas carried with it the burden of such an airline. In-flight service was thought to be horrid. Hard products were always lagging behind, and everything associated with Qantas was, at least from a foreigner's point of view, a little lousy. As someone who was born and bred in Singapore, we always looked at Qantas as a last resort if we ever needed to go anywhere. And because of the airline's somewhat racist reputation, their fares were often bargain basement cheap from Changi Airport. Look, I never ever thought there was any truth to this racist reputation. But this connotation was somewhat amplified in the 90s when the running joke in my classroom was that Qantas is now called Pauline Hanson Airlines. Yes, I come from a rather prestigious school where a lot of us travelled overseas for holidays. And no matter what the reputation Qantas had with foreigners, one thing for sure was that Aussies endeared themselves to the airline in droves. On the backbone of these lousy in-flight offerings, the advertising peeps struck gold. They saw that no matter what the airline did, Australians would always come back to Qantas because they find comfort in the flying kangaroo. Therefore, tapping into the airline's rich heritage of being one of the world's oldest long-haul airlines, and the comforting feeling of home, this intangible and yet absolutely powerful slogan called the Spirit of Australia was coined in the 1980s. The first major branding revamp was carried out when it went from this to this. And together with the slogan, another iconic tune, I Still Call Australia Home, then became the unofficial Qantas anthem for the next few decades. This was one of the most successful airline campaigns ever. Heck, I wasn't even Australian then, and even I was brought to tears watching the ad for the first time. The haunting innocence of the children's choir, against beautiful backdrops of serene locations, and climaxing into a crescendo beckoning us to fly down under with Qantas. The airline was riding high in the minds of those who saw this advert, and like a drug, we were hooked. It was weird, because I knew the lyrics to this song before I even stepped foot into Australia. By all accounts, and I say it again, this campaign was so successful it became a tough act to follow. So what went so wrong after this? From here on, we begin the branding downhill journey of Qantas, the spirit of Australia. It is now 2008. Jeff Dixon has handed the reins over to the incoming CEO. Alan Joyce would go on to be the longest ever serving CEO the airline has ever had. Prior to this, Jeff Dixon has tried his best to reduce operating costs of the airline, but the legacy trimmings of labour costs remain stubbornly high due to the protection of workers' unions. During his time, he has weathered strikes and industrial actions from both flight attendants and ground engineers alike. Towards the end of his leadership, Qantas began looking outside the organisation for their employment needs. And from here on, we bring in the two very dirty words of labour hire. And going forward, I'll be exploring this from the perspective of flight attendants, since they, as I've mentioned earlier in the video, are one of the key components in delivering the airline's branding messages. As the aviation industry flew past Y2K and ushered in the year 2000s, the scene was littered with tombstones of large legacy carriers from all over the world. Varig Brazilian Airlines, Swiss Air, Sabena Belgian World Airlines, Olympic Airlines, and we didn't have to look too far, Ansett Australia. So Qantas knows it cannot remain the way it is as a legacy carrier if it was to survive the years going forward. And Alan Joyce was then tasked to take the Jeff Dixon project of a labour hire trajectory into the future. So, from 2008, there was no longer any cabin crew hired directly by Qantas on those union-protected legacy working conditions and pay packages. Labour hire companies would come to the rescue of Qantas to drastically bring down the cost of labour. And this reduction, as you will soon see, is extremely severe. To understand the dynamics of what this means for a flight roster, let's take today's flight as an example. I am on board QF 739 from Sydney to Adelaide, and the likely mix of this 737 crew on this flight can roughly be categorized into 4 classifications. We have the direct hire full-time cabin crew from the legacy days, a labour hire full-time cabin crew, and a smattering of other labour hire casual employees who are paid by the hour. The last 2 categories are capped at that number to make this explanation simple. A cabin crew's daily work pattern is seldom only one flight. Especially when you're talking about domestic operations, their typical day would involve 3 to 5 short-haul flights a day, and including reporting time, can amount easily to a 10 to 12-hour shift. So let's assume this flight from Sydney to Adelaide would be the last flight for everyone working on board. And let's throw in a delay from earlier today to lengthen their working shift. So by the time we arrive in Adelaide, they would have worked a total of 15 hours. And this is where the inequality of award rates and financial penalties come into play. Let's start with a direct hire full-time employee and assume that he or she has worked for the airline since 2005. And with the labour hire full-time cabin crew, their annual pay is roughly 15 to 20,000 less than their legacy counterparts. These 2 categories of cabin crew are subjected to overtime payments today because their workday has gone beyond 12 hours in a shift. As for the other casual employees, it really depends on which labour hire companies they come from. Some have it in their contracts they're eligible for overtime penalties, which is an X amount applied on top of their hourly rates. For others, some companies do not have such arrangements, so their hourly pay just multiplies according to the amount of hours clocked. Remember that delay I spoke about earlier? Let's say because of that, the turnaround here in Sydney was so tight, none of these cabin crews could take their scheduled break on the ground. Once again, this would mean very different things for everyone. For the first 2 groups, penalty payments will be given as compensation. As for the casuals, it once again depends on the contract they're on, and one group could receive payment compensation and another would not. So at the end of today's flight, this entire team on QF 739 would have arrived in Adelaide after performing the same job, but with vastly different financial outcomes. With this context in mind, put yourself within the last few groups of cabin crew from the various labour hire companies and then try and carry out the airline's requirements to bring forth any sort of branding messages and communications. It is noteworthy that these cabin crew now form majority of those who are welcoming us on board. So there could be a cabin manager who has risen through the ranks of a labour hire company since 2008, and she could be supervising a senior cabin crew from the legacy days and still be paid way less in that management position when compared to that senior cabin crew. Imagine going to work with this sort of dynamic imbalance. It is now 2010. By now, the airline has most of their workforce handled by about 30 labour hire companies, and 17 of these alone handle recruitment for cabin crew. Some of these companies are partly owned by Qantas or a wholly owned subsidiary. And it's not just the cabin crew getting their wages shrunk. The in-flight product would also very slowly see the disappearance and shrinkage of several key items. Between 2010 to 2020, we said goodbye to hot towels. This was part of the service routine in business class and premium economy. I remember receiving them as recent as December 2019, but they've now all been chucked away. We also said goodbye to pre-departure drinks in business class on domestic flights between the East Coast cities. However, these bevies are still being served if you're flying on longer transcontinentals between Perth and the East Coast. Speaking of transcontinental flights, business class meal setup went from this to this. If you'd like the full experience of white linen tray table makeup before your meal service, then you'd have to fly on QF9 or QF10 between Melbourne and Perth, because that's the prestigious non-stop flight between Perth and London. So business class passengers on the domestic leg get treated to the full works. Perhaps the most glaring change of all was the economy class meal service. In 2014, the meal service looked like any other airline flying the skies. And then this turned into this, and this, and this. A trailer's serve of a main dish with a bread roll, and the starter or salad is now gone. So is the cheese and crackers and wine glass. This has seen the workload of the cabin crew somewhat increased because they would now come down the aisle multiple times for a separate bevy service, a hot bevy service, and a dessert run. Well, according to the PR spin, this new service protocol introduced in 2014 would allow the cabin crew to interact more with passengers, therefore enhancing the Qantas experience. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, please. The scheduled block time chocks to chocks for QF 739 between Sydney and Adelaide is 1 hour 55 minutes. And this is the standard meal tray service you see here in business class. I'm looking for a like-for-like comparison from another airline in the same aircraft type with similar flight duration, and voila! Singapore Airlines between Singapore and Phuket on the 737-800. You can see the difference in presentation styles, and while there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with the meal quality on Qantas, there just isn't any pride in putting forward something aesthetically pleasing for the eyes. I'm now heading into the final portion of this video, which is to discuss the actual direct treatment of the Qantas brand by the airline themselves. I once again cite the example of Singapore Airlines, which currently holds one of the world's top positions in terms of brand equity. The entire brand of the airline centers around the iconic Singapore girl. This brand direction even dictates how cabin crew is seen in public. You would never see them eating or drinking even within the aircraft cabin. You also won't see them catching a train to the airport. nor will you see them catching a sneaky cigarette at an airport overseas. The airline is so strict about branding consistency, every marketing collateral carries the same font type, color palette, and if all branding items are found anywhere, unless it is destined for the Heritage Museum, they are quickly destroyed and disposed of to make sure they don't fall into the wrong hands. Let's look at the present Qantas branding, which was introduced in 2016. It features a modified kangaroo, now thought to be more aerodynamic. The red sash of the tail has a thin silver stripe in front to separate it from the Euro-white fuselage, and a sleeker and slimmer font type to represent its futuristic ambitions. I actually feel it's one of the best airlines liveries out there. So you'd think the airline would double up quick time to make sure this new brand identity is quickly rolled out, right? Wrong. At the time of editing this video, we're nearing the end of 2023. So 7 years later, we're still looking at aircraft with the older livery running around. And no, they're not part of the Retro Rule special liveries. Even the Qantas lounges are not spared this branding oversight. On this trip, at Auckland Airport, the lounge is still carrying the old brand identity. I think Townsville Airport takes the cake though, because the Qantas Club there is still carrying the brand from 1984, and this photo was taken in 2021. This is a very good indication how much the airline values their brand identity, which in turn translates into brand equity. If this happened at Singapore Airlines, several people would have already lost their jobs by now. So, in conclusion, the Qantas brand has been in a steady decline for over a decade. The public anger against Qantas by the Australian public has been well documented, so I don't know what else is there to add that hasn't already been said. Alan Joyce is a face that's very easy to hate, but let's not forget he was hired for one purpose, and that's to lead the airline ahead to financial prosperity. And that was what he did. So as far as the Qantas board is concerned, he has performed very well. But what they had not anticipated was the severity of this public anger, leading to Alan Joyce reading out a scripted, televised public apology, which went badly. He was eventually asked to resign early. Let's not forget also the anger at the Qantas board as well, and how they were yelled at by shareholders at the last AGM. It is not a good sign when the incoming CEO begins a term by giving out an apology as well. And the words rang a little too familiar to the script. We've listened and we are sorry. If you're listening now, where have you been all this while? Vanessa Hudson was the CFO when Alan Joyce was in charge, so she's considered part of the old guard, and the pessimist in me thinks nothing will change anytime soon. So the brand will continue its decline trajectory with these sorts of dynamics at play. However, just how low will the brand continue to sink remains to be seen. And sadly, I am not hopeful.
And welcome to Adelaide, everyone. So this is flight number 9 of the travel series, which means I've come to the end of it. And yeah, this has been such a fantastic travel series. So by the time this goes to air, it is probably time for me to start another new travel series. So if you do not want to miss out on that, Make sure you are a follower on my Instagram, so I shall chuck details of it on your screen right now. So hit me up there, and so you can see what am I up to in real time. And of course, more importantly, do not forget to hit the subscribe and the bell notification icon so you'll know every single time when I embark on another eventful travel series like this one, okay? So take care all of you, and I will see you for my next video. Bye!